crucifixion of Christ. We drew it all together at the end, thinking about the horrors of the crucifixion. And just wanted to mention a couple things as we think about the crucifixion. You know, Jesus said several different statements on the cross. And virtually every one of them was a quote from the Old Testament. And one of these is the phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And that really disturbs us. And yet we said last time that really that is a quote from one of the Psalms of David. It was Psalm 22. Now, a lot of the so-called fulfillment of prophecy that we see in the New Testament from the Old is predictive. Yes, something is predicted and it comes true. But another way, though, the Old Testament is used is sort of an association with something that happened in the past. It's sort of like what's happening right now. And sometimes Jesus meant this when he spoke words from the cross. But this Psalm 22 is really a view of what happened on the cross as Jesus was killed. And I've heard John Barnhill say that we have such little description of what actually happened on the cross in the New Testament. We really have a picture more from Psalm 22 about what happened on the cross. And this Psalm 22, these are the phrases, all who see me mock me, they hurl insults, they shake their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Well, that's exactly what happened. Remember, they mocked Jesus and said, if you're king of the Jews, come down, save yourself, if you're God. He says, I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It's melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth, and you lay me in the dust of the earth. Dogs surround me, and a pack of villains encircles me, and yet they pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display, and people stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. And yes, that's exactly what happened. And yet this psalm ends up in victory, where he says, all the future generations will be told about the Lord, and they will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. And we see again the fitting together of all of God's plan, hand in hand, lock and key, of God's redeeming love predicted through King David many centuries ago before it happened, as Jesus was on the cross, fulfilling the sacrifice as the Messiah. And one other thing I would mention also before we start on the crucifixion, on the resurrection. Jesus suffered on the cross. And we've talked all about that. But one of the things that made the suffering so hard was him being rejected by all the people. Being rejected hurts, right? To have the door slammed in your face, to be pushed aside and ignored. Now, remember when Jesus began to tell his 12 that, listen, I'm headed toward Jerusalem, and I'm going to tell you very plainly that I'm going to be rejected and I'm going to be killed in Jerusalem, but I'm going to rise on the third day. And this was the time that Peter said, no, Jesus, you're not going to do that. We're not going to let that happen. And this is the time that Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You're not doing the work of God, but the work of man. Let me just read this. Jesus then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and teachers of the law, that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And I'd never thought about this till this week. But the rejection of Jesus was very obvious. We read in the Garden of Gethsemane that the 11 that were with Jesus fled. An hour or so later, Peter denied him 3 times. I don't know this man. And as we see the crucifixion, there's no mention of crowds of support. There's no mention of sympathy. There's no mention of anybody except the women at the foot of the cross. His mother was the Apostle John. And these women that had come 50 or 60 miles from Galilee down to take care of Jesus in his last days. We think about, well, what could have happened? Oh, there could have been a sea of supporters and a rally and protests and signs and cheering Jesus on even though he was on the cross. And as things would happen in our political world, they'd be chanting, 3 more days, 3 more days, 3 more days, something like that. But none of that happened. Jesus was alone. Jesus was alone between heaven and earth. He was rejected. And it dawned on me this week, as I was reading some things, that was so hard, wasn't it? That's so devastating to be rejected, and Jesus was. Okay. All right, now the good news, the resurrection. Let's turn to Matthew 28, and we're going to read scripture here and see about the resurrection. This is Matthew 28, beginning with verse 1. We'll read the first 10 verses of that. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. And there was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning. His clothes were white as snow. And the guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He's not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now, I've told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." We know that the 2 Marys had watched Jesus being buried. They were very attentive. We read right before this passage I just read, that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there by the tomb watching everything. And they went home, prepared spices to anoint the body, but they observed the Sabbath, which is the next day after the crucifixion. They came to the tomb on Sunday morning. Now we know that Jesus was in the tomb 3 days, and that is sort of confusing for us. But let's remember, in their day, the next day began at sundown. We began the next day at midnight. Well, they didn't have, a lot of clocks, of course, that day and time. So to make it easy, they just said, all right, when the sun goes down, it starts the new day. So Jesus was put in the tomb on Friday afternoon, late, before Friday turned into Saturday on sundown Friday evening. So he was in the tomb Friday, part of Friday. He was in the tomb all of Saturday, and then it rolled over into Sunday. So he was in the tomb 3 days, as he predicted many times. The ladies came Sunday morning, and it was early, at dawn, very, very early. They went to the tomb. A great earthquake had occurred. Stone was rolled back. Angels were there, glowing, white as snow. And these Roman guards, who were commissioned to stand guard at the tomb for 3 days, shook and became like dead men. Were they? Did they faint? Don't know. But you know what? These angels just ignored the soldiers. Didn't even talk to them, didn't do anything. As far as I could tell, the angels spoke to the Marys. The angel said, well, what are you looking for? Do not be afraid. I know what you're looking for. You're looking for Jesus. He's crucified. He's not here. He has risen, just as he said. Now, that was a little bit of a well, the word is upbraiding, a little bit of a correction, I guess. And Jesus told you people he was going to be raised on the 3rd day. So you should have remembered that. And the angel sort of rubbed it in a little bit. Look, he has risen, just as he said. Okay. They caught the point. I'm sure they caught the point well. Now, just come see where he lay. Then you go quickly and you tell his disciples he's risen. You're supposed to go to Galilee eventually. He's going to meet them there. That was 50 or 60 miles away. And sure enough, the women hurried right back to the disciples. Jesus met the ladies on the way. They talked a little bit. He says, don't be afraid. You should go tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. This is the condensed story of resurrection morning. Can you just imagine what these two ladies saw and felt and heard? We think of angels as being sort of, floating around in the clouds. But every time an angel comes in Scripture, they're feared. They're feared. And these Roman soldiers were incapacitated by these angels. And the ladies were scared to death as well. And they, no, don't be afraid. He's risen, just as he said. Everything's on cue. Everything's working out. Everything's on plan, just as he said. Just go back to the 11, tell them, go to Galilee, and that's where we'll line things up. Okay, that's Matthew's view of this resurrection. We'll pause there. Any thought or comment or question on this view? Yes, sir, Dr. Matt.
It's you're who started off, this is sort of the, if Paul Harvey was teaching today, he says, now the rest of the story.
Yes.
We
Okay.
had the cross,
Yes.
we had the tomb,
Yes.
but the message, and the reason I believe, the reason there's not much about that is because that's not where he wants our focus.
Yes.
He wants us to focus on the empty cross.
Yes.
The empty tomb.
Yes. Exactly. He did not dwell on the horrors of the crucifixion. He's dwelling on the resurrection. That's right. You remember, the Jews said, this impostor said, I'm going to be raised in 3 days. Remember, the Jews had asked for Roman soldiers to guard the tomb? All right. Let's see what the Jews had to say about all of this. Let's read verses 11 through 15 here in Matthew 28. When women were on their way, that is, running back to tell the 11, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priest everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders, devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. These guards were eyewitnesses to what happened. I don't know about you, but if I had seen angels come and overwhelm me and roll the stone and somebody rise from the dead, I think I would say, this is special. I need to pay attention. This is special. But instead, they ran back to their authorities and said, "Oh my goodness, let me tell you what happened here. Jesus rose from the dead." And any good person would have said, "Tell me, really, what happened? Are you sure?" And these eyewitnesses, these Roman soldiers could have said that. But what did these Jewish leaders do? They bribed the soldiers with money, hush money as we would call it, to say, "Oh well, the disciples came and stole Jesus' body out while we were asleep." That was the very thing they didn't want to happen. That's the very story they didn't want to have to tell. That's why they originally let the soldiers guard the tomb, was to keep the story being started like Jesus' followers came and stole the body. But yet it played into just the opposite of what they had planned. Jesus was resurrected. They couldn't explain it. So they paid the soldiers to lie about it and say, "Well, yeah, we soldiers just went to sleep and they stole the body." Now, not only that, they said, we'll tell that story here. If the Roman authorities question this, don't worry, we'll cover for you. We'll take care of them as well. Meaning a bribe. So here's deceit, here's lying, here's corruption associated with the Jewish leaders. They hated Jesus so much that even the miracle of the resurrection could not change their heart. If we had seen a dead man rise from the dead, we would say, "Tell me more," right? They said, "No, let's just tell this story." Now the interesting thing, verse 15, this story now has been widely circulated among the Jews to this day. Who wrote that sentence? That was Matthew. Matthew that wrote this book. Was he a Jew? Yes. All of Jesus' followers were Jews. But as Matthew wrote this down, he sort of separates himself now from the Jews. He says, now this story has been told among the Jews to this day, as if to say, that's not me. I'm not part of that anymore. This story has been told by those people, as if to say, not me. And that's significant, because little by little, Jesus' 11 apostles left, are finally getting it. The break is made between the old covenant, new covenant, and Jesus is resurrected. All right, let me pause there. Any comment or question on that? The bribing of the soldiers. All right, Luke chapter 24. If you've got that, we'll look a little bit there. Luke chapter 24. This is the Gospel of Luke's vision of the resurrection. And we'll read the first 12 verses there of Luke chapter 24. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here. He's risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves. And he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. We see that the ladies had come Sunday morning to anoint the body with spices. We read that from just a few verses right before chapter 24 starts. They had prepared the spices, but yet on the Sabbath, they observed the Sabbath, stayed home. And they didn't wait long when Sunday morning came. They said it was just early in the morning, just break of dawn. They went to the tomb. It was important. That was first on their list, to go to the tomb of Jesus that Sunday morning. They didn't find the body. And again, the story about the angels coming and saying, why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here. Remember what he said, that he would be delivered over to the hands of sinners and be crucified, be resurrected on the third day. And then it says, yes, then they remember the words. And we see over and over again the followers of Jesus didn't get it, didn't connect the dots about the resurrection of the third day until it happened. And we think, how did that happen? The only thing is that they were so focused on Jesus. He's our leader. He's the Son of God. He's the Messiah. He's our champion. He's got to be victorious. And then when he gets put on the cross, they're just devastated. And I think their emotions just overcame them. Their view became so short, not to see and remember Jesus' words about the resurrection. And they were so caught up in their grief and their agony, especially seeing the physical torture on the cross. It was just overwhelming. It just dulled their senses to think clearly. And the angels had to say, remember, he said he was going to rise on the third day. And they said, okay, yes, I remember now. Why didn't we think of that? Why didn't we remember that? They were human. You know what? If we were writing a story about our hero, a fairy tale about our hero, we wouldn't put all these little glitches in that, showed our human weaknesses, would we? Everybody would be perfect. Nobody would doubt. Everybody would be top of their actions. But the biblical record, the story of God, shows how we humans struggle with our faith and following as well. And that's a major reason we know this is inspired scripture. We see that the ladies go back, tell the 12, tell the 11 that Jesus has risen, and they didn't believe him. It's nonsense. It's an idle tale. Here were the 11 men hearing the story of a resurrected Christ. And see, these 11 didn't remember about the third day resurrection. Can you believe that? It's nonsense. That can't happen. But it did. Peter ran to the tomb. Okay. Let me pause there. Any comment or question here on Luke's view of things? All right. Let's go to John. Yes, sir, Dr. May.
As you're sitting here talking, Peter says, what happened? He mumbles that for 50 days, and then on the day of Pentecost, he knows what happened and delivers the greatest message of his career.
Exactly. Peter was their leader for bad in denying Jesus. Peter is going to be their leader a few days later. Absolutely. All right. Let's turn to John chapter 20. And we're going to see how Peter actually goes to the tomb, does what he does. John chapter 20. We will read the first 10 verses. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, which means John, who is writing this account. The other disciple is John, the one who Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple, meaning John, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. We remember Peter as being the point man for the 12 apostles. He was first to speak, first to act, first to do. He was brash. He was not bashful. Peter and John hear this story about the tomb's empty. These ladies tell us the tomb's empty, and so they begin to run. And John beats him. John's a better runner, and he gets to the tomb first, but he's respectful, timid, looks in the tomb. Peter comes up behind him a little bit, and he just goes right in. He's not reserved. He just barges in. But what do they see? Now, John, the eyewitness, writes this, that the grave clothes, that is, they wrapped the body in linen, as their custom was, and put a separate cloth around the head. He describes the grave clothes in a way that says they were sort of still there, as if the body had been removed, but the wrappings were still there in place. They weren't tangled up. Jesus didn't struggle and fight through all this stuff to get out. It didn't look like our bed sheets after we've had a fitful night and trying to collect our wits the next morning. It was prim and proper, just as Jesus had it as he lay there. That's the view John records. Jesus' body came out miraculously. It was not a struggle. It was by the hand of God. And this is what Jesus left for us to see. John saw it, and he wrote it here, how it was lying there. And it says, John saw and believed. And then in verse 9, by his own self-admission, John has to say, they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Our man John, who writes this, still had to admit, we still didn't remember, even at that time, that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Can you believe that? After they saw the cloth, still they said, oh yeah, we still hadn't connected the dots. Okay. Can you pause there? This is now how Jesus appears to Mary. Verse 11 of John chapter 20. Mary stood outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and another at the foot. And they asked her, Woman, why are you crying? They've taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they've put him. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not realize it was Jesus. He asked her, Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for? Thinking that he was the gardener, she said, Sir, you've carried him away. Tell me where you have put him, and I will get him. Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. Jesus said, Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord. And she told them that he had said these things to her. Now, this is Mary, a very, very touching scene. And we think, Mary, you have been with Jesus. You knew him so well. You were taking care of things for him. And you didn't recognize him when you saw him that morning. Well, let's remember, we need to be very cautious here. Whenever we have buried our loved ones, buried the closest to us in our lives, we're in some kind of a fog. We're overwhelmed with grief and emotion, and we don't think clearly. That's a given. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the way God made us. That when our bonds of earth are broken, if it doesn't tear us up, something is not right. So all of us experience the agony of burying our loved ones and the fog that deals with all of that. And Mary does the best she can. She looks around and she can't find the body, and she's worried. And Jesus appears. She can't recognize him. And thinking he was the gardener that took care of the cemetery, she very sincerely says, "Sir, if you carried him away, tell me where you put him and I'll go get him." Notice the words Mary says. She uses the word him 3 times. Where have you put him? Have you carried him away? I will get him. She didn't say, where did you put the body? What have you done with the body? Or the remains? Him. As if he's still there. He's a man. He's a person. Where have you put him? Tell me and I'll get him. She's serious. She's devoted. And then Jesus says, Mary. And she recognizes it. And she calls out to him. In the fog of what Mary was going through, it was Jesus' voice calling her name that broke through all that. When Jesus calls our name, we respond, right? And here's what Mary did. She wanted to hug him. No, don't hug me yet. Just go tell people, tell my brothers, I'm alive. And she did. That's the story of the resurrection. That's the story that seals our salvation. It validates all of the plan of God, Old and New Testament. It validates Jesus' prediction of rising on the 3rd day. And you know what? It was like pulling teeth to get the 11 plus the ladies to understand Jesus was going to rise on the 3rd day. It took all of this. But you know what? Once they got over that hump, man, they were believers, weren't they? They could not be stopped. They were new people, rejuvenated people. Let me pause there. This is our story. Any thought or comment as we close this morning? Any thought or comment? Yes, sir, Dr. May.
Of course. 2 things. I think the message in that last little bit is that we're in the period of time before the next coming. We're exactly where the Hebrew people were hundreds of years before Jesus came. They were expecting the first coming. We're sitting in anticipation of the
Second coming, yes.
And he will reveal himself to us, to individuals that need to know. People will be revealed. And just like multiple stories in the New Testament about he talking to somebody and they didn't realize it until he revealed himself.
Yes. We're going to talk about that next week. I've got 2 more lessons on Jesus' appearances after the resurrection, next 2 Sundays. And then John Davidson is going to be teaching for a while, beginning July 21st. So 3 weeks from today, get prepared. John Davidson will take over for a while after we finish up our lesson here. All right, thank you very much.